There are more than 7 billion people alive on Earth today, each with a different perspective, lifestyle, and culture. With so much diversity in the world, differences can easily erupt in disagreement, conflict, and sometimes even violence. They can be like a dangerous third rail lurking beneath a subway platform. But conflicts can also be a blessing. They can forge understanding and empathy between people. Fortunately, the Bible offers some practical, time-tested advice on managing conflict. Join us for this 6-week series on resurrecting unity and harmony in our world, beginning with our own lives. Well, welcome to the second week of our series that we're calling Mind the Gap. Mind the Gap is a famous slogan that warns travelers on the London Underground about the dangerous open space between the edge of the platform and the oncoming train. And we think that's a great analogy to talk about the dangerous gaps that can happen in human relationships. Gaps that result in disagreements, conflicts, and sometimes even violence. And to avoid those outcomes, we all need to mind the gap and try to manage conflicts in a healthy and a loving way. Unfortunately, the Bible has a lot of advice about how to do that. And so last week, in the first episode of the series, we looked at the source of all conflict. And we said that the source of all conflict is our own false belief that we know the truth and the other person we disagree with does not. Now, truth can unify people, of course, but the problem arises when we think we have a monopoly on the truth. The prideful need to be right only hurts other people. Love, in the midst of conflict, starts by acknowledging that each of us only has a partial understanding of the truth, and that we need to be curious about how the other person is experiencing the situation and listen with empathy to his or her understanding of the truth. Now, in today's episode, we're exploring something a little different. We're looking at a few traps that are easy to fall into when trying to navigate conflict. And the funny thing is, they're all in the gospel story this week. In fact, it's a model of how not to handle conflict. So let's take a look at the gospel. You remember this week's gospel story is actually a continuation from last week. It began last week with Jesus going into the local synagogue in the village where he grew up. It was at the beginning of his public ministry. He had done a few healings in a place called Capernaum. But then he comes home and he goes into the synagogue. And, it was your basic church service, like what we're doing today. People gathered to pray and to listen to the readings from the Bible. And rabbis like Jesus, passing through the town, were usually invited to preach as guests. And so Jesus opened the scroll and read a section from the prophet Isaiah that predicted the coming of the Messiah. But then instead of a typical sermon, Jesus made a bombshell announcement. He said to them, "Today, this scripture passage is fulfilled in your hearing." What he meant is, I am that Messiah that Isaiah was predicting so long ago. And that's when things got ugly. Unlike in the movies when the hero comes home from the big city, in this case, Jesus gets nothing but grief. After he had finished speaking, they were all amazed at him. They spoke highly of him. They were amazed at the gracious words that came from his mouth. But that didn't last long, because then they started talking amongst themselves and they started asking each other, wait a minute. We know this guy. Isn't this the son of Joseph? He grew up here. Who does he think he is? Other versions of the story say that they took offense at him. But notice something. The people never spoke to Jesus about how they were feeling. They never approached him directly. They never said, "Hey, Jesus, this is making us a little uncomfortable. Can we talk about this?" No, what they did is they just gossiped and complained among themselves. And that's the first common mistake that many of us make when trying to deal with conflict. It's called triangulation. Triangulation. And here's how it works. Most people hate conflict. I hate conflict. I have to deal with it a lot, but I still hate it. Most people hate conflict. Given the choice, most of us would rather have a root canal than speak directly and honestly to someone with whom we're upset. And so we convince ourselves it wouldn't do any good to talk to that person. It would just make things worse. Why bother? And so instead of confronting the person who hurt us, we start telling the story to other people, to third persons, trying to gain their empathy, right? And to tell us that we're right in the conflict. We tell the story from our point of view, leaving out all the messy details about the mistakes we made in the conflict. We want that third person to tell us that we're not the problem, the other person is. But the problem with triangulation is that it doesn't give the other person the opportunity to explain. And it just tends to spread mistrust and create division among people who end up being forced to take sides, sometimes among friends or family members. Jesus himself once said that if someone hurts you, go and tell that person his fault between you and him alone. He didn't say, go have a glass of wine with a friend and complain about it. Well, that's the first common mistake, triangulation. The second common mistake when it comes to conflict is what's called the misattribution of intention. It's a big phrase, but basically what it means is we assign bad motives. We attribute bad motives to the person that has hurt us. And it's exactly what the villagers do to Jesus. You know, Jesus was there just simply trying to tell them that God had sent him into the world to love and forgive them, that he was the Messiah, that they'd been waiting for so long. But the villagers saw it as an insult. What they heard was a local boy, too big for his britches, telling them that he was the big shot Messiah and they were just small potatoes. You see, when we've been hurt by someone, we often assume that the other person intended to do it, right? And we assign bad motives. Oh, they did it because they're bad or whatever. You know, when your spouse forgets to pick up the dry cleaning, right? It's because he's irresponsible and he just doesn't care about you, right? Or when somebody cuts you off in traffic, it's because, it's not because they're racing off to the hospital to be with a loved one. It's because they're a mean, selfish jerk. When your supervisor asks you to redo your work, it's not because, you did kind of shoddy work. It's because she's out to get you. When your teacher gives you a low grade in school, this never happens to you, I know, but if you did, you would probably believe that he just favors the other students and doesn't like you for some reason. But what's interesting is that we don't do that to ourselves. We don't assign bad motives to ourselves when we do something wrong. When you forget to book the airline tickets for your family vacation, it's not because you're irresponsible, it's because you're just so overworked. And when you're cranky, it's because you're just so stressed out. Why can't everyone around me just understand me? We assign bad motives to others when they hurt us, but we don't assign them to ourselves when we mess up. That's the second mistake. And they did it to Jesus. They assigned bad motives to his announcement that he was the Messiah. Then comes the third mistake. And this one is often kind of what sparks a lot of the conflicts in our lives. After Jesus realizes that the villagers are gossiping about him, he goes to them, right? So he doesn't triangulate. He goes to them and he challenges them by telling them something they didn't want to hear. And sometimes we have to do that in a conflict, right? We have to tell somebody something they don't want to hear. We should always do it in a loving way. And that actually happened to most of the prophets, right, in the Bible. That's what the first reading was talking about. God said to Jeremiah, hey, I appoint you to be a prophet, and yes, they're going to hate you, they're going to fight against you, they're not going to like what you say, but I will be with you. So, what exactly did Jesus say that set them off? Well, he referred to two examples in the Bible of when God seemed to treat non-Jewish people better than Jewish people. And that was the final straw. See, Jesus had challenged their belief that as Jews, they were the only people acceptable to God. Back then, that's how they divided up the world. It's different today, of course, but the ancient Jewish people saw it as Jewish people good, everyone else bad. And that was their belief. And Jesus was challenging that belief. And this is where so much conflict in our lives erupts. When we say or do something that challenges someone else's belief system and they don't handle it very well, or we don't handle it very well when they challenge our belief system. See, conflict usually isn't a disagreement about the facts, right? It may seem that way. We always argue about the facts. But really, when you get down to it, a dispute is usually about the beliefs that we attach to those facts. And the mistake we make in times of conflict is we tend to argue about these conclusions rather than just listening, as we said last week, and being curious about how the other person came to those conclusions. Because once you can figure out how each of you came to the conclusions that you have that you're arguing about, maybe you can find some common ground. Well, that's not what happened in the gospel, actually. See, the facts were not at issue there. The Bible clearly stated that non-Jewish people would be included in God's plan of salvation. That was in Isaiah chapter 2, Isaiah chapter 60. All the Jewish people knew that. They knew that. But you see, after centuries of being oppressed by the Gentiles, the non-Jewish people in the nations around them, the Jewish people had just come to believe that those other people were evil, and therefore God hated them. And when Jesus rightfully challenged that belief, he tapped into the emotions, several core emotional concerns. And that's when they didn't react well at all. The people in the synagogue heard that, and they were all filled with fury. They rose up and drove him out of the town. See, these three mistakes are incredibly common. They even happened to Jesus. He didn't do anything wrong, but they happen to us all the time. In fact, these three mistakes were right there in the first conflict that ever happened in human history. Do you remember when that was? The first conflict in human history. It was shortly after we were created. And it was between God and humanity. You see, you might remember the story of creation in the book of Genesis, right? God created Adam and Eve, this allegory about how we were all created. And he put them in a garden, and he told them that they could eat all the fruit from all the trees except one, from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But then in this story, the serpent comes, and he creates a conflict. And notice how he does it. He does it with these same three things. First of all, he tempts Eve to eat the forbidden fruit. But he doesn't encourage her to talk to God about it. Oh, you don't like not being able to eat that fruit, Eve? Maybe you should talk to God about it. No, the serpent just triangulated the conversation and got Eve to believe what he had to say. Problem number one. Then the serpent also tried to convince Eve that God had bad intentions. He told her that God prohibited them from eating the fruit of that one tree simply because he didn't want them to be like him. And isn't that selfish of God? Misattribution of intention. Second problem. And then, of course, the third problem is the serpent challenged Eve's beliefs about the consequences of eating the fruit. He didn't say, let's talk about this. How did you get there? I want to listen, No, he just challenged her belief, and she bought it, and there came the first conflict between God and humanity. And ever since that first conflict, God has been working to bring us back into harmony with him and with each other through love. And love is the only way to resolve conflicts. That's what St. Paul was talking about in that second reading, which is just one of the most beautiful passages in the entire Bible. You've probably heard the second half of the reading from many weddings that you've attended, right? But I also love the first section. Paul basically says, look, you can be the most wonderful, perfect, holy person in the world. At least you think you are. But if you don't have love, and your good deeds are not motivated by love, then you're nothing. It's all for naught. All the good things we try to do every day, the good person we struggle to be, are for nothing if they're not saturated with love. And here's what Paul says about love. It's patient. Love is kind. It's not jealous. It's not pompous. It's not inflated. It's not rude. It doesn't seek its own interests. It's not quick-tempered. It doesn't brood over injury. Oh, how often do we do that? It doesn't rejoice over wrongdoing, but it rejoices with the truth. It believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. And love never fails because of all that. It never fails to bring people together. And we could add to that list of all the good things love is, we could add our mistakes today. We could also add that love does not avoid difficult conversations. Love does not triangulate. Love does not assume the worst in the other person, and love tolerates and tries to understand the beliefs of others before condemning them. See, the only real way to manage conflict is through love. You know, every day you and I suffer emotional injuries. A lot of them we sort of stuff down, we forget about. Sometimes they're small little things. People look at us the wrong way, or they may have one tiny little word that seems critical. Sometimes they're big things that hurt us. It happens to us every day. And so this week, when you feel hurt, try to be attentive to that. And when you feel hurt, when someone cuts you down or cuts you off, try not to assume the worst. Try to talk to them about it if you can. And when you do, try to listen and understand how they got there. Or if it's a stranger, you know, that you can't really talk to and they somehow hurt you, like cut you off in traffic, what I like to do is write a story in my head about why that person might have done that, why they might have lashed out at me today. Something bad happened to them. And you know, when you do that, you don't get so mad about it. That's love. And love corrects every error. It reverses every mistake, it covers every misstep, and it bridges every gap.